Morning.
Morning.
It's Thursday, April 17th. Today we are going to go a little deeper into school construction than we were able to before we voted out our education bill. Because there's going to be a lot more we're going to need to do in the future about it. And then we're going to revisit H-115 because Representative Burkhart did a little bit more research on this after we received, after we heard a first conversation about it. And so we're going to revisit that. And then after the floor, we are going to talk about tax increment financing. We are eventually probably going to get a bill from House Commerce or House General about a new version of TIF, but I thought it would be helpful for all of us to just spend some time refreshing our memory about how TIF works under current law, the increments and all that stuff. So that's what we're going to do after the floor today. And then tomorrow morning, in case I just forget to tell you, please be on time tomorrow morning because we are going to hear an amendment to S-27 that is on the floor at 9:30. So we're going to need to be efficient on that one. So with that, Ashlyn, would you like to join us? Thank you. Unfortunately, in a perfectly executed set of agenda planning, we would have gotten a very full update on the school construction task force at the beginning of this section, and we did not. So we are really starting from a fairly low level of understanding on this, despite the fact that we put some money in the fund in the future. And look, you were so prepared for that.
Well, also in a perfect world, I've been out a lot. My kiddo's been having some chronic ear infection. So in a perfect world, I would have gotten to you all sooner with sort of a more broad view of school construction as well. So definitely appreciate the time this morning. For the record, my name is Ashlyn Doyan. I'm the Director of Policy in the State Treasurer's Office. And I'm going to start broad, move quickly through that, and then get down to sort of the details. What I'll just say is in your House passed version of the school construction bill, there is sort of a lengthy section that discusses both aspects of like programmatic criteria for school construction as well as the state aid award mechanism. And I'm really focusing on that funding piece, the state aid award mechanism. The treasurer's office is not really in a position to opine as like how many square feet are needed per student or what sorts of, like learning facilities, whether it be STEM arts, et cetera, are needed in schools. That's just not our area of expertise. We come more into the picture when we're talking about that funding financing mechanism and especially how it interplays with the state's overall financial picture. So I think that folks on the Ways and Means Committee are pretty familiar with the state's debt management process, being a money committee. But basically, the state treasurer's office is charged with managing the state's bond and debt obligations. And part of that is the Capital Debt Affordability Advisory Committee and the recommendation that it makes biannually based on a number of debt metrics ratios. This is the recommendation for the sort of total number that the capital bill should be. And that's based on a number of different calculations, such as debt as a percentage of personal income, debt per capita, an assessment of sort of asset depreciation ratios, and other things. All go into sort of the CDAC committee's assessment of how much the state should be borrowing year over year. For the 26-27 biennium, this recommendation was $100 million split into 2 years, so essentially $50 million per year. This recommendation has been going down year over year as a trend. This year is an $8 million reduction from the previous year. And prior, I think also you all are probably familiar with the fact that there was a state aid for school construction program that existed previously that was paused, those state commitments used to come out of the capital bill and they took up a significant portion of the capital bill. And so at the same time, we were attempting to reduce the amount of money that the state was borrowing overall. And so I think that it predates me, these discussions, but part of the reason for the state aid pause was that the capacity of the capital bill was becoming more limited, and this sort of sector was taking up perhaps more than what folks thought it should be among the overall needs for the state. The treasurer's office participated in the school construction aid task force, which was a legislative charge in 2023. And the task force really evaluated the scope of need for school construction in the state, as well as kind of started to think about what the best model for starting up a new state aid for school construction program would be. And it really kind of, the Rhode Island program kind of bubbled to the top, right? I think people probably are familiar with Massachusetts having a school construction aid program, and they have a lot of gorgeous, beautiful schools. But Massachusetts isn't really comparable to Vermont. They're so much larger. They have so much more money to spend. Rhode Island is a much smaller state. It's much easier to sort of compare what Rhode Island is doing to what Vermont's doing. Rhode Island's been really successful. They have, been able to put hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars towards school construction in recent years. And they have been able to maintain our bond ratings at the same time. This program has not counted as net tax supported debt. And that's really the key consideration for the treasurer's office here, is that whatever program we do decide to get started again, well, first, we have to make sure that the state understands the scope of the financial commitment year over year going forward once we start it up. But also, we really want to make sure that it doesn't count as net tax supported debt, because if it does, then our bond ratings can be affected, and that makes borrowing costs not only more expensive for the state, but also more expensive for the entities that leverage the state's bond ratings, such as the bond bank, which is likely the institution through which all of these districts will be doing their school construction projects. And so it behooves everyone to make sure that our program is crafted in such a way that the rating agencies don't count it as net tax supported debt. And I say all of that to explain that it's not just like this accounting standard that we want to make sure that we adhere to. There are real dollar implications for not doing so. And I think sometimes that can get lost in the nuances and complexities of these conversations. And, I note here that right now the state's bond ratings are quite high. We have the highest bond ratings in New England, and that does allow us to have advantageous borrowing costs. I'll say that when I started in the treasurer's office, we were a AAA rated state, and now we sort of have the second highest rating. And so our bond ratings have declined in recent years, and we're constantly working to try to get back up to that AAA status so that we have the most advantageous borrowing rates. The Rhode Island model, the sort of key piece of it that the bill that you passed does mostly capture, is that it uses a debt service subsidy model, which means that the state is not committed to paying the actual debt service or to facilitating the bonds for the districts themselves. What the state is providing is some aid to the districts that is based on a proportion of their debt service costs. But it really is state aid to the districts, and then they can use that to pay for their debt service costs, or it's a portion of the debt service costs. But the state is like legally not paying the debt service. The state is providing a subsidy that is related to its amount. Michael is here, and Michael Gahn from the bond bank, and I told him that he can feel free to jump in and correct or annotate or add to anything that I'm saying. So I will just say that I welcome those if I'm misstating any of it.
Just a clarifying question on the subsidies that are given.
Yeah.
Are they tied to debt, so like, does it have, do those dollars have to be used for debt service, or are they fungible once the school gets full?
Well, so right now, the bill has the state paying the districts. We are going to suggest some language later on in the presentation here that we'll be presenting in the Senate, which has the bond bank acting as the fiscal agent. So it's, depending on how all of that works out, it's possible that, well, the state would be paying the districts and then the districts would be working through the bond bank to pay their debt service.
Or
Or,
Maybe we could answer that question when you get to that portion of the presentation,
Okay.
more depth,
okay. that's
so we can.
I'm gonna spend the next couple of slides talking about sort of the order of magnitude of the required state commitment based on modeling that we did for the school construction task force. But I think that the bill that you passed basically represents what the work that the task force did. The bill that you passed has a 20% sort of base fee with a possibility up to a 40% subsidy based, on whether or not a project meets certain yet to be determined criteria. And so
Can I ask you a question before you jump into all of that? So, when the two task forces met and did all of their work, it was sort of before we had done this significant work about sort of reimagining of the system, unfortunately.
yes,
Which is probably not the best order of operations, but such is life.
yes,
And, the sort of full inventory of school construction needs, I think, is probably not accurate if we think about the future portfolio we're discussing.
yes,
And then the other sort of variable that we have now changed, unfortunately, is the move to a foundation formula instead of
Yeah.
local raising. And so I just want to flag that because I imagine you have not been able to completely catch up, and we're going to need to catch up eventually. And that's part of why we're starting this conversation now.
sure. Well, I think that in the next couple of slides, I'm going to just speak specifically to what I anticipate the costs for the debt service subsidy could be, not on the scope of need overall for school construction, because I totally agree with you that what we were contemplating prior to the new plans being created in the bill was totally different. And it's unclear what the new needs are going to be, but I think that we still know that the needs are probably going to be
A lot.
a lot. So, talk about the debt service subsidy. I think that what you can expect, even when I'm talking next, is that the demands will probably still likely be more than what we modeled for mathematical ease.
Great, thank you. Yeah, Representative Holcomb.
Just out of curiosity, given the upheaval in the bond markets, the fact that the interest rate went up something like 13% 1 week, is that also reflected in your modeling?
No, these are the numbers that we actually put together 2 years ago. And the interest rates hadn't changed that much until like this year. And I think that it's really hard to predict what they're going to be when this school construction program is ultimately up and running. So I'm not, yeah, no, your point's well taken. I'm just not really sure how to answer that. I have no idea what the markets are going to do.
I don't think any of us does. I just want to know if it was reflective.
Yeah.
If these are recent or old numbers.
Yeah, it might be a good question for Michael to answer. I do think that the appetite for municipal bonds historically in the market has been really strong. And so, these interest rates are probably like lower than what you get when you go out for a mortgage, right? So, yeah, hopefully that's helpful. But so when we did modeling, we modeled both 20% and 40% subsidy options. I think that sort of the first type of modeling that we did was for like $100 million of projects total, $250 million projects total, $500 million projects total for the different subsidy amounts. And that's what you can see in sort of the top lines of that graph on the left. But But I think that probably what ends up happening programmatically is more something like this, where there is a certain number for projects that the Agency of Education thinks should be supported with the state aid program year over year versus a total one-time infusion of projects. And so this orange graph is really what I am hoping that the committee understands. And this is looking at $100 million worth of projects per year at 20% state subsidy. So that your base level state subsidy. So this is probably going to be higher. And I don't know if the total cost of projects per year will be higher based on what the needs are going to be after the district reform, or based on what projects are ready for the pipeline. But the subsidy will probably be higher because there will be bonus points added based on the criteria. But it's really just the structure of payment that I think is important to understand and I'll admit that this is complicated for me and I've sat through a couple of joint fiscal presentations, but I understand that the supplemental district spending, am I using the right terminology? I swear I didn't cheat. But there's maybe some thinking that the supplemental district spending could be used, like the waterfall of it could be used to support school construction.
That was the goal.
Okay. And I don't know how much that's anticipated to be, and I don't think anyone really does at this point because we don't know what the construction of the districts is going to be, et cetera.
And I don't think we ever imagined that it would capitalize a fund or fully fund a fund. It was just like extra money for fun.
Yes.
Okay.
But so just for background, so that you have this in mind, if you did do something like that, where you had a certain number of dollars worth of projects in mind and you provided this kind of subsidy, the commitment in the first years is pretty low, right? But then as you layer on more projects year over year, it goes up. And this has sort of a gradual slope that levels off after 30 years when some of those bonds mature and you have that debt service sort of starting to fall off. But what's not contemplated here is inflation. So your slope is probably going to look a bit steeper in reality because we know that the cost of construction goes up a lot, sometimes faster than the rate of inflation generally. And then also, as you get farther down the road and your districts get sort of more well-seated and the projects the project ideas start to evolve, you're probably going to have some bulges in certain years as well, just because of the nature of doing a one-time reform and then having one-time changes needing to be accounted for. So I just want to make those comments about what the state's commitment looks like. And I know that in the bill, it's subject to annual appropriation into the special fund. Just as a comment, once these districts go out to bond, we are suggesting language that says that the state is not legally obligated to pay for the debt service in future years if the appropriations don't exist. But once a district goes out to bond and they're relying on that debt service to be paid, you may hear from your constituents if those appropriations don't flow through. And I'm also not sure how that's really accounted for in the foundation formula.
So the foundation formula does not include anything regarding debt service, just really regular maintenance. And that's pretty much how foundation formulas work all over the country. I have two questions. Well, I have a question and a comment. One, on the question, and maybe it's a question more for Michael when he comes, but if we don't have statutory language that's really explicit about our obligation for the state share, will that present a challenge for these new districts when they go out to bond? Because they will essentially be taking on a larger risk than they are planning on covering themselves. And then the comment is, calling it a local share, given our statewide education fund and the fact that we're talking about possibly county-sized districts and all of that. I know it's how it's described in every other state, but it is intuitive in a way that I don't think is in keeping with policy, and it's an intuition that I'm sort of trying desperately to upend.
Sure. Yeah, no, that's fair. So maybe retitling that to be something like,
District share
yeah,
or ed
district
fund share or something.
or non-direct state share or something like that. There's a lot of wordsmithing that's been going
So
on.
much.
Yeah,
Terrible, yeah.
and I think I'll let Michael answer that question, but my like initial response is that I don't think that it makes it more difficult for them to go out to sell bonds, but because we have, if they go through the bond bank, there's something called the state intercept. So there are other ways for the debt service to be paid. If their like budgets aren't ponying up the money for the debt service. But I do think that it, and I don't even know how this really works, but right now in most districts, you have to have a town like bond vote in order for these big projects. I don't know if the future of state commitments is not 100% certain whether or not it makes it harder to pass those bonds.
Mhm.
My guess is that that's the case.
Yeah.
And so I don't,
We can wait until Mike.
yeah, okay, great.
Could you just repeat those last two sentences again?
Yeah, sure. So if the state commitment to provide the subsidy is not 100% certain in the future years, it could make it more difficult for communities to pass the requisite bonds for the construction projects.
Yeah.
You're welcome. So really just what I want folks to understand from this slide is that when you have a program that layers debt service year over year, the costs ratchet up over time before there's a leveling off. And I'm not even sure that you do see a leveling off once you incorporate inflation. I think it really just does ratchet up over time. So there were a couple of recommendations from the School Construction Aid Task Force report that I actually think I have a lot of praise for the bill and the work that the folks did in drafting the school construction section. I think that the majority of this is captured. One recommendation that we had made explicitly was that programmatic aspects of the program, such as staff for the Agency of Education to carry this work out, are not paid for with bonded dollars. And I was in the Appropriations Committee when the bill came through and that was being discussed, and I think we're good there. I think that's well understood and incorporated in the bill. We also recommended that the State Treasurer's Office discuss any prospective major fund and revenue sources with the 3 rating agencies. We have discussed the bill at length with our financial advisor and our bond counsel. We have not gone to the rating agencies because it's really hard to say, hey, we have this bill that's still very malleable. That's not really a good practice. But if the bill passes, over the summer, that is a conversation that we will likely have. And I think that one thing that the bill does really nicely is it paces all of this out over time. And so I just want to say that for the record, we'll be having an ongoing analysis in our office of this. And if there are any sort of red flags or unintended consequences or implications, we may be back next year with additional proposed changes.
And we are imagining that a lot of work still needs to be done on this next year. So we're going to welcome that and spend a lot of time with you.
Thank you. Yeah, I think that's wonderful to have anticipation of an ongoing work to make sure we get this right out on the table. The last thing on this slide is that the task force really recommended that the governance framework for the new program comes first before the program actually starts up. And I think that the bill also does a good job of that. There's a lot of committee work that happens with the Agency of Education, and the Treasurer's Office will pay attention to that. Like I said, before we actually start handing out awards, there's still some time for us to see how this is all going to shake out and come back into, if we have any concerns. So I just wanted to sort of give some praise here and also tie the work that the House did back to some of the recommendations from the task force report. With that said, we do have a couple of recommended pieces of language that we are going to, that I was hoping to share with you all in your committee, but it looks like we'll be sharing them on the Senate side instead, because you are so efficient. And so the two pieces that we'd like to include are they're right after the description of the subsidy in the award of construction aid piece. This is on, I think, page 40. My Zoom thing is blocking at 45 of the House passed unofficial version. We're hoping to add in bold that the annual amounts are subject to annual appropriation and do not constitute a pledge of faith and credit or taxing power of the state. We think that that is the critical piece that will help us avoid it being considered net tax supported debt from the rating agencies. The second, and this is a recommendation from the bond bank, is adding further down in that section that the Vermont Bond Bank will serve as the fiscal agent of the state construction aid reimbursement program. The Vermont Bond Bank will provide timely reimbursement of debt service costs after verifying the payment by the awarded district. The role of fiscal agent will occur for all district debt service issuance, including both local school district bonds purchased by the Vermont Bond Bank and by other parties. Nothing in this chapter will diminish the powers of the Vermont Bond Bank and the Vermont State Treasurer. Here's sort of the explanation for those two recommendations. For the first edit, like I said, this really lays out that the school construction aid is an appropriation to the school district and not a direct payment for the debt service. And then in the C paragraph, this is really for Michael and his team, but there are a lot of advantages to using the bond bank. It will be more efficient. They have experience doing these school district bonds. And they also have the advantage of the state intercept, which achieves lower borrowing costs for everyone. And therefore, like lower the borrowing costs are, the lower the prospective debt service subsidy needs to be for the state. And then there's this other portion in the bill that I think Michael is going to speak to more in depth, but this is about how we kind of reconcile existing debt obligations for districts with the new school districts and how we might transfer those debt obligations. And from the treasurer's office perspective, like the debt obligations that current districts have still have to be paid. And I think Michael has some ideas on how best to work that out that he
That would be
might be
delightful.
willing to share, and even some ideas as to whether or not maybe a report is the best way to be handling them, given disclosure considerations.
Okay.
That's the end of my
Those
presentation.
numbers in there, are those line numbers for when you copied and pasted?
Yes.
Here.
Oh, the slide you were just on.
Oh, yes, I copied this right
Okay.
from your,
Okay.
right from the bill this
Okay,
morning.
great. No, it's fine. I just wanted to make sure I hadn't missed.
Yep.
Okay, that happens to me all the time. Yes. Okay, no, it's totally fine. I just wanted to make sure. Any questions you get?
I can appreciate having to put in the explicit language saying it doesn't create an obligation on the part of the state. It is implicit without that language, right? I mean, just making it, and the suggested language is saying, this is the plan, but just so you know, state doesn't have to make these payments. Just seems like it's making explicit what is otherwise implicit.
I think that the thing here that's tricky is that these districts are probably going to be going out to bond for 30 years. And so, I think that this current legislature, if it passes this new program, is making an implicit commitment. We don't want the district's obligation to pay their debt service to be tied with to the state making an obligation to pay a debt service subsidy, because then legally the bonds are being supported by the state. So I think that the language in here makes it really clear that while this current 2025 legislature or 2026 legislature next year is making an implicit commitment to subsidize their school construction costs. No matter what happens, they are still on the hook for paying their own construction costs.
I guess that's the question that I have is because it'd be really hard to pass a bond if it's up to a future legislature to decide, you know what, we're not going to do that because we have more pressing needs somewhere else. So it's
Yeah.
without that debt obligation on the state.
I mean, I totally understand that.
Yeah.
What I'll say is,
You're welcome to walk behind her.
Rhode Island has a really similar structure.
Okay.
And their program is quite successful. So.
How old is it?
Pardon?
How many years have they had it?
5 or 6 years. So, that's what we have to work off of. That's sort of the model. I totally understand your caveat. The limited evidence we have, I think, suggests that it hasn't been a concern so far, at least in the one state that we're using as an example.
Representative Holcomb.
Can you help me understand that though in the context I share your concerns. We have a statewide funding system. And so I'm trying to understand how any of this is a local responsibility, just implicitly when we have a statewide funding system and we've approved centrally which projects move forward. How is that not a state liability?
Yeah, I can speak to that.
Okay.
Okay, we'll wait, then. We'll wait. Let me do that. Thank you.
And I just also want to say, the state has in the high 600 millions in terms of debt outstanding right now overall as a state, right? And we are clawing back at our AAA rating. The scope of school construction need is easily and the prospective project that might come in the first couple of years is easily several times that, right? And so I think there is no really, I think that the ideal is probably unrealistic to achieve, and this is a really good model. And if we were to all of a sudden have net tax supported debt on the state's books that is several times what we currently have, I think that could be really problematic for a lot of the other things that we need to do as a state. So there are, in addition to the bond bank, VHFA, VITA, VSAC, they all are leveraged off of the state's rating. And so, school construction in a vacuum, it's oh, what's the big deal about the state's rating, right? But then all of a sudden, if your housing costs and your, business investment and your student loans all get more expensive, then you run into some problems. So this is why the treasurer's office is so protective of this rating.
And frankly, we have fairly destabilized markets right now, and I don't think we want to be doing anything to further destabilize them in Vermont. Representative Wasizak, and then there were some other hands, other places, so, which seems like there are a lot, so we'll just start with Representative Wasizak.
Okay, I very much appreciate where you're coming from, and you bring up the interconnectedness of what the bond rating will really do to the state's fiscal situation. And subject to annual appropriation has to be right up there with rateable reduction, with some of my least favorite phrases when we're talking about legislation. And so, I think if we're making this, the dollars go somewhere. If it's not in school construction, those dollars end up moving to deferred maintenance or something. The cost still has to be paid eventually. And I would love to find a way to have the state make a commitment and put the dollars behind that commitment without jeopardizing the bond rating. And if that's not possible, obviously your office knows that a lot better than I do. But that's just, when we were talking about the big education transformation bill and the funding formula, there was already some nervousness, I think, from some of our members of well, what if a future legislature underfunds that foundation formula? And we can't, tie future legislature to everything. But if we're getting into a situation where dollars are tight, I could see a avalanche of underfunding the school construction programs and underfunding the foundation formula and a bit of a we death spiral.
I want to offer that I think there's a middle path that I don't know if we can achieve, but I think is one to aim for, which is we are explicit that this is not a complete obligation of the state, the way the treasurer's office has asked for. And as much as I've said 20 times this year, like a special fund or a dedicated fund is actually sort of a psychological magical construct and all money is fungible. A dedicated fund for school construction, I think will alleviate a certain amount of those concerns and, yeah.
Okay.
So I do think that there's a balance we can find a way through here. I think Representative Maslin and then Higley and then Odie and then Burkhart. Does that sound right to people?
Some of the questions you've answered, I think. One of your earlier slides, sorry I was here late.
Okay.
Who'll be the fiscal agent? Who's the fiscal agent now? That individual SUs or something?
Most districts use the bond bank now.
Oh, they're already.
Yeah, there are only like 2 or 3 districts that go outside of the bond bank, right?
Two currently.
Okay. And then,
And can you say your name for the record?
Michael Gahn, Executive Director of Vermont Bond Bank. The state aid program, as I understand it, historically was a direct transfer from an agency of education to the school district. When I give testimony, I'll explain why the difference.
and I missed the word of the paragraph I still back, but I think I'll pick it up because I can't get that sentence back up here quite immediately. So
Okay, sure, no problem.
thank you.
I understand the study committee was out there. I guess you're talking about a bill, and I don't know what bill we're talking about.
Oh, the school construction bill that was on the wall in the education committee, that was the product of the second school construction task force, was folded into 454 and we passed out of, it's part of 454 now. And we passed it and edited it.
Okay.
Yeah.
That's what we're talking about.
That's what we're talking about.
Thanks.
Yeah. I forgot what I said
You said
before.
Carol and then.
Representative Odie then Burkhart. Thank you, Representative
I think
Burkhart.
my question is possibly about 454, not this specific topic, but
Okay.
listening to this has made me wonder about the structure of what we have in 454. So I'd like to talk about it, but probably not. now.
Maybe we'll have time to, maybe after we have all of our witnesses, we'll have some time. Representative Burkhart.
Yes, Ashley, can you tell us any more about how the school districts are structured in Rhode Island and how they vote on school budgets?
Good question.
That's where I'm going.
That's a good question.
They're oftentimes a department of the city or town. I think there's a couple different models, but those are ones I think we looked at, so they're voting. Good question as to whether they're voting.
So if they're a department, does that mean then like city council sort of approves the budget and then puts it on the ballot as part of like?
Not
this-
sure.
Don't know, okay. And so my follow-up question for you is just, bless you, if the full faith and credit of the Rhode Island state government is not behind those bonds, like what's the pricing look like for districts when they then go out to bond for a project? Because in South Burlington, we talked about this a few years ago when we were thinking about completely rebuilding the high school and middle school. And there was a question about just how much of the state's power really is behind what we're doing. And it makes a difference. And so somewhere in the chain, there's this cost. And I hear what you're saying about the interconnectedness of all the other things that are dependent on the state credit rating. But then I also just wonder about what that impact is, especially if we're talking about brand new municipalities. They're essentially going to have no credit history or no history of passing budgets previously as we're starting to embark on this.
So similar to how under this structure, we're contemplating using the bond bank as the fiscal agent. The bonds in the Rhode Island school construction program have to go through an entity called the RIBEC, which is very similar to the bond bank, but really only does school construction. And so their costs to borrow, Michael, are pretty good, right? Because they're all going through the same place and getting that.
Yeah, I believe Revit
on
has a
scale.
state, I mean, over 30 states have a state intercept mechanism, which I could talk about, an offset mechanism. It's a fairly common form of school bond credit enhancement. And I believe Revit has the same powers.
So
Fiscal distress, you may call Rhode Island. Rhode Island is not exactly at the local government level, something that the markets love, but that I believe they overcome this with the state intercept.
and while we'll have new districts, the bond bank has been working for a long time on facilitating school district bonds in Vermont.
Right. Okay.
Rashli?
Yeah, just a quick one. I know that among the factors affecting the bond rating are things like our pension liabilities. How does our years of unfunded infrastructure liability, how does that impair our bond rating?
That's a good question. Rating agencies are starting to incorporate an assessment of liabilities into their ratings, and we've also been beginning to incorporate an assessment of liabilities into our CDAC recommendation as well. I think that for the state ratings specifically, the way that the education system is currently structured, the state of our schools and the costs there is not specifically on the state's books. It's more on the municipalities and school districts books. Things that are contemplated for the state rating would be the deferred maintenance liabilities on state-owned buildings. As we move to a new model with a foundation formula, I don't know how any of these things change. I don't want to speak out of turn as to how the rating agencies might consider something or not.
That would be helpful to look into. They'll still be structured as separate municipalities, and Michael, you're about to come up, so let's just wait until you join us. Yeah. Anything else for Ashlyn? Thank you so much for your partnership on, Representative Odie.
Thanks. Somewhere here, one of these slides, it's talked about paying as you go.
Oh, yes. So the state of Rhode Island also used $500 million of what's equivalent. They used $500 million in addition to the state debt service subsidy to give to school districts for things like planning costs, architectural fees, pre-construction work. The task force understands the importance of that work and that those costs are difficult for districts to come up with, especially when they are staring down a really sizable bond and debt service subsidy commitment for decades. However, the construction task force also recognized that the ability for the state to support the debt service subsidy is already quite limited. And so we detailed how that worked in Rhode Island in the report, but did not recommend that that Vermont also support those kinds of dollars for school districts at this time. If Vermont were going to find some cash dollars to support those costs, it would be important that it would be cash, not bonded for dollars. So I say previously in 2023, we were thinking okay, if there was maybe some sort of general fund surplus, if we were restarting a school construction aid program, maybe that could be a good source of it. But that was when we were trying to also, but that was under sort of the thinking of wanting the whole school construction program to not be factored into kind of the inequitable distribution for costs among districts at the current. So it's not even, so a lot of our thinking on that is not really relevant anymore under this new proposal.
In the thinking about new thinking under the new proposal and the fact that likely there will not be a great deal of time between the moment that the Senate votes this out and the conference committee finishes its work and it goes to the governor's desk. If you could give some thought to the best way to structure that rethinking process over the summer? And let us know if you want more official versus less official thinking, that would be great.
Sure. I think I can just say, I think that we're pretty satisfied with the structure that's in the bill right now.
Yeah, great.
And feel like there's enough opportunity for the treasurer's office at least to engage in the committee work that's already going to happen. I don't think that there's there are not any additions other than these two in highlights that I would propose at this time. Although Michael might have some with respect to the transfer of debt. I'm not sure. I'll let him speak for himself.
Great, thank you. Yep.
Specific on the pay-as-you-go and seeding the studies about engineering and everything else. From an accounting perspective, usually those costs can capitalize in the total cost of the project afterwards, correct? Am I right in that?
I'm not sure how that works on a project by project basis, but I think that what we were seeing in Vermont, you know, in the years preceding this task force report, is that districts were doing a lot of this planning work, and then they were having bond votes that failed. So they were never able to capitalize this in a long-term project. They were spending hundreds of thousands of dollars, if not millions of dollars in planning costs. And then their projects weren't ever getting to that point where they could find a way to pay for that more manageably.
Just thinking a bond for that construction could pay back whatever cash reserves were used to do that, but yeah, thanks.
Did I see new hands or did I?
Well, I just, to Rep. Kimball's point, that South Burlington has literally been master planning and visioning since 2008. And there,
I think Woodstock has as well.
yeah, and so it's just, it's millions of dollars at this point that have gone to architects and consultants to try to figure out what we're doing. And we had some minor success with elementary schools, but we've just never cracked the nut on middle and high school. And
And I don't know if I've, you know, my vague memory of I've read a few too many reports this year, and so they're all merging a little bit in my mind. But the idea that there are sort of templates for the future so that all of those costs don't need to be incurred at the local level, I think is important. Representative Fulcom?
I was gonna say some of the same, I really hope we can pay attention to the unique nature of our statewide fund. And I think it has done some perverse things around the success of projects. I think it's also done some perverse things around the willingness of the state to support equitable access to construction projects. And I think we have to have that conversation.
Thank you, Ashley. Nope.
I have a question for you.
Okay.
Okay. If the
Thank you, Ashley.
foundation, the foundation amount does not include construction, but it includes some maintenance. So does that prohibit the use of it? I don't recall whether it prohibits the use of it
Thank you, Michael, for joining us.
for things like doing architectural plans, or what if the district doesn't have to go for any extra supplementary district spending, and then they do take on bonded indebtedness? Can that come out of their foundation amount?
So, and I'm not an education finance expert, and so this might be better asked by one of the foundation formula experts that we heard from, but my understanding is that a foundation formula, one of the sort of tenets of it is that it does not obligate that the money is spent in any particular way whatsoever, right? There are no rules on how that money is spent. And it is set up in such a way to meet the efficient and effective use of towards educational needs of those students. And outside costs, such as school construction, would mean that there would be less money in that district for the other basic things.
Yeah, so then my question from before, because it brought up voting, and that was exactly what I was concerned about. If you have a district, they have the foundation amount, but they also decide to do supplemental district spending, and then they're relying on that for paying teachers and so forth, and then they decide to bond. And they are in the middle of a construction project, and then the school, the voters just say no to the supplemental district spending. Now the district in the new world, the district has to decide what to cut because it's obligated to those bond payments. It's obligated to the rest of it.
Let's save that hypothetical and very useful, interesting question and everyone's responses to it until after Michael.
Oh,
Great.
Well, I had a chance to introduce myself. Michael Gahn, Executive Director of the Vermont Bond Bank. I'm honored to also introduce someone you know, but perhaps in a new context, Nicole Lee. Just state your name.
Nicole Lee from Vermont Bond Bank.
But hopefully we'll get her on the record as well. So I was sort of prepared to discuss the specific bill here, and I typically have a longer windup when I talk about education, construction finance. So I'll just give you the narrative version. Basically, the bond bank is coterminous with all of the school buildings that we now need to
What do
replace.
you mean by coterminous?
Meaning like we were created because of school construction in 1969, 1970 legislative session. Yeah, it's kind of an interesting oral history. So we were the first bond bank in the country. At that time in the 60s, we were building new schools. The schools had been financed with bond anticipation notes or short-term notes that were placed with the local banks, different banking regulatory framework. At that point, the banks didn't necessarily want to hold those bonds long-term. And so there's some vestigial parts in statute where you can carry over a ban for 10 years. And that was because of that period. We had a bit of a capital crunch, and some bankers and some good lawyers somehow found their way to Vermont. The bond bank idea was originally pitched in New Jersey. They declined it, and then Vermont became the first bond bank in the country, and has quite a legacy in places like Alaska, New Hampshire, Maine, Virginia as a result of that.
Representative Melvin.
Yeah, our recollections from the select board days is that bond bank is also used for highway equipment.
Yeah, we can be, yeah, town highway for sure.
Thank you.
We see a lot of that. So, where was it going with this? Oh, so our largest bond that we ever issued on an inflation adjusted basis was our very first one. It was to take out all of the short-term borrowing for school bonds in like 1971. So fast forward 50 plus years, and it's no surprise to us that we're having this conversation, and we face, a similar risk where the new schools will have the same vintage, and we'll be facing the same replacement cost down the line. So kind of an interesting history. Today, as Ashlyn had mentioned, we've financed just about every school that has debt outstanding right now. At some point, that was sort of consolidated. The municipal bond world, there used to be way more money in it, so bankers would work harder to find individual deals. And there are, back in the 80s, there were individual school districts that were still issuing their own bonds. That's no longer the case, other than some, unique situations. So we have 220 million in school debt that's outstanding as of December 31st, 2024.
You said that one more time.
220 million. You also have Burlington, which I think is around 90 million for the high school project right now.
That's sitting with you all, right?
That's not with us. They have their own credit rating. They issue their own bonds. And then Winooski, who found a very good deal with USDA rural development. And that's great for them. But we were talking to them up until they decided to make the switch there. So one thing we like about having the bond bank there, and this is just, I'll stop talking about the bond bank, but we're kind of a floor in a lot of ways. And we, even if someone doesn't use them, you can be assured, like in Winooski's case, they didn't use us, but we could be assured that they were getting a better deal than the next best alternative, because we were always there with access to capital markets and a low cost, thanks to credit support from the state. So where to start here? So there were some questions that were bouncing around.
While you're thinking about where to start, one place I would love for us to end is a very hypothetical conversation about what to do with the existing debt that's sitting with this.
Yes, and we have some thoughts about that.
Back to you.
So there were some questions bouncing around. The market is a mess, I suppose. Both the treasury market as well as the municipal bond market. Municipal bond market is 4 trillion. Treasuries, I think, are like, I don't know, 20 trillion. So there's not as much liquidity in that market. What's going to happen in the future is anybody's guess. Another huge policy consideration is like, well, the tax exemptions still exist when the the extension of the TCJA tax cuts at the federal level are, when all said and done. I think it will, but we don't know. So trying to speculate on what interest rates are going to be by the time we get this all figured out is kind of a fool's errand, I think. What we can be assured of is that the bond bank allows us scale for a rural state to efficiently access capital. Even though we're pooling all the loans together in one bond issuance, it's still relatively small in the market. So what we don't want is for individual school, I mean, they're welcome to do it. We're completely voluntary. And if they find a better deal with a bank or USDA, all the better. But we do gain efficiency by pulling things together. We also ensure that we're good stewards of the state's money because we have the credit enhancement, primarily via the state intercept. That's what's most effective for us. We can be assured that the schools are borrowing at a AA plus, AA2 rate with the bond bank, and therefore obviously keep costs lower. I had a thought that I am blanking on.
Could you expand a bit on the credit enhancement?
Yeah, sure. So credit, oh, right. Well, this is good. Thank you. Thank you for jogging my memory. So I first had this conversation in 2020. February 2020 is when school construction discussion really heated up. And I was like, oh boy, this is a huge liability that we need to start thinking about. And so even though it's been 5 years, we haven't sat idly. One of the things, the two forms of credit enhancement we have, one is the state intercept, whereby if a borrower, and we have this both for municipalities and school districts, but if somebody doesn't pay us, then we, under statute, and that's one of the things that was up here, the statutory reference, that was the state intercept mechanism. We ask the treasurer's office to redirect payments to us so that we can backfill any debt service due. This is very common. We have a loan with USDA. Offset mechanisms are very common. If you owe this party money and you've got some money out over here, they offset, what would otherwise be due. And then that's extremely effective, and over 30 states have that.
Just effectively a short-term loan from the treasurer's office to you until.
No, that's money lost if we don't get paid. So, and we're allowed to keep doing the intercept until we make up the shortfall. So we have to manage the liquidity on our side with respect to the bond payments. But that exists. And then the other mechanism we have that's less impactful is the state's moral obligation. And VHFA, as Ashley mentioned, VHFA, VITA, and I don't know VSEC that well, but they have it as well. And so in 2020, when we started looking at this liability, I was like, right now, the moral obligation is not a huge consideration for the rating agencies, but if we add a couple $2 billion, it will be. So we actually restructured our security structure and our bond issuance to anticipate school construction. And it's a long, tedious process whereby we have to seek consent from bondholders, and it takes a long time. So we're almost there. It should happen towards the end of this year, beginning of next year. And that will allow us to reduce our dependence on the state's moral obligation by 70% or so. So I'll say that to say that like we're very focused on this issue and we see it as a huge issue for the state. So I think that answers your question and allows me to finish my preamble.
I'm not sure I totally understand the state obligation.
Say that again?
The intercept?
No, the intercept I get.
Okay.
It's the moral obligation.
Yep. So that is effectuated through a debt service reserve fund. So a pot of money that sits there when we issue bonds that is never drawn upon, earns interest. But if for some reason we couldn't pay debt service on our bonds, we would draw on that pot of money to pay debt service. Under statute, we're allowed to ask the governor to then in turn ask you for an appropriation to backfill that debt service reserve fund. Never been used, subject to appropriation, but that carries a pretty high rating, 2 notches off the state's rating. So AA3 in the case of Moody's. Yeah.
Do all states have the requirement that you first have to ask the governor and then he asks us?
That's the way a moral obligation typically works.
But you could do it without, we could change the law now and make it so they can come straight to us.
Potentially, I wouldn't even worry about it because we're trying to reduce our need on the moral obligation. It hasn't been used for any of the instrumentalities. So that's not something we lose a lot of sleep over.
Yes, but I feel like I might lose sleep.
Okay.
So
Representative Odie, I think
right.
Ashley wants to jump in to help answer your question.
Sure. So again, for the record, Ashley from the Treasurer's Office. The total amount of moral obligation that the state offers to all of the financial instrumentalities is a function of our total, the state's total debt outstanding. I will say that I think the entity that utilizes it the most right now as a credit enhancement is VITA. at this time, like, we would certainly not recommend any legal structural changes relative to the moral obligation. I think that what we have in statute now is probably pretty standard to how other states nationwide have theirs set up, and this is sort of a larger construct that is like viewed by the financial markets in a certain way, and we have not run into any problems so far. We've never had the moral obligation have to be used, and if for some reason there's something catastrophic and we needed to make changes, we would definitely come to you all to do so, but I just think this is probably, like Michael said,
Yeah,
you don't have to worry about it, don't fix what isn't broken.
Other
This is
than-
something that is working well for all of us.
Other than the bond bank, the other instrumentalities have their amount capped in statute. The bond bank has both the treasurer and governor approve our bond issuances as a check and balance on the amount that we use.
It's a more concern that we also have in statute that the governor must give us a fee bill every year. And I'm just, and we haven't had one for 9 years, so and we also have executive branch in federal government doing things, so that's why I'm bringing this up.
Representative Odie, I think for now, given all the other things we have to worry
Fine.
about, we were gonna trust that both the bond bank and the treasurer will come to us if there's a problem with this mechanism being fulfilled.
Mm.
And if a problem does come up, then we can act on it.
But it's a good segue to the next thing I'd like to talk about, which, oh, sorry.
But we were, yes, Representative. No, go ahead.
I'm the one who needs the repeat of interest.
Yes, absolutely. No problem. Okay, so what's your school district, I suppose? Okay, so if we have a loan with them, they, let's just say it's a smaller project, they, updated the gym or something. But they don't pay us, we have semi-annual payments. If they don't pay us on the due date, then we have a timeline under an MOU with the treasurer where we say, hey, treasurer's office, Georgia did not pay us. They say, okay, we're going to notify the folks over wherever Vision lives. We're going to notice the folks that run the Vision system. Instead of directing the next payment back to the school district, they're going to direct that payment over to the bond bank only in the amount by which is owed to us on the loan payment. And then we backfill the amount that was owed to us. We're okay, our structure works. And then they either, raise that money in the next budget or figure out a way to come up with that. It's never been used. And again, it's extremely form of credit enhancement. 30+ states have it.
So is it a federal thing or it's?
No, it's a state. Yeah, it's state driven.
Okay,
Yep.
thank you. That's helpful. Is there a list anywhere where we can see schools and amounts?
Of debt outstanding?
Yes.
Yeah, it's on our website. We have a great loan database on our website, award-winning, but it was a great opportunity. GFOA gave us an award for it. But with the moral obligation and the bond bank, and the reason Ashlyn was talking about really having this state aid subsidy be subject to appropriation is because all of these things are forms of financial leverage. So the bond bank, our debt, which is like 650 million-ish these days, 660, something like that, is I mean, it's not considered net tax supported debt of the state. So we have the ability to, and our debt outstanding is close to the amount that the state has outstanding. Because we have all the municipality, for the most part, we have almost every municipality, every school district using us. So we have the ability to issue debt in greater proportion than the state itself, while not endangering the cost of borrowing, because we're leveraging the state's rating. So that's why protecting this ecosystem is so important for us, and was the substance of the comments both the treasurer's office and the bond bank gave to the various school construction task force. And that's really, at the end of the day, we think we can solve this from a
Like you have a political economy issue you have to work through, you have an equity issue you have to work through, but from a financial engineering perspective or access to markets, we sort of have the box already built, which is terrific. A lot of states would be starting at ground zero on this. So we think we can absorb whatever the school districts can pass, all else equal. The world is on its head right now, obviously, with regard to America's status as American exceptionalism. And so the markets will react to that. But let's just say we're having this conversation 6 months ago. I'd be comfortable making that statement. There's obviously you got to repay the debt, but in terms of accessing capital for the projects, we're comfortable with that. So long as we can continue to maintain the state's rating. And obviously it's not just school districts, as Ashlyn referred to, that have large liabilities. We've got huge climate issues, housing, et cetera, that we might, I'm less concerned about the difference between a AA+ rating and a AA rating, and more concerned just about the capacity to address Vermont's challenges in the future in terms of preserving the rating. But the way we lever up is by having the bond bank facilitate the debt issuance. So I think that answered a decent amount of the questions that rose from there. So would you like me to, are there more general questions, or I can talk about the proposed legislation?
I think there's some general questions and then the proposed.
Just one quick clarifier. Did you say the state intercept has not ever been used?
Yes, correct. Yeah.
Representative Maslin, did you say?
Yeah. You phrased just a minute ago, we could issue this. That can, or whatever, bonds, I guess, could be issued in greater proportion to the state itself. Can you explain just what you meant by that?
Yeah, so our the debt that we issue, the bond bank issues, is credit enhanced by the state.
Okay.
But with regard to the intercept mechanism, there's no liability on the state, and that's what we're trying. That's the dynamic we're trying to preserve.
Yeah.
So that debt is on the bond bank's books, sort of not on the state's books. Eventually, it gets rolled up since we're your child, but that's the way we can facilitate this, basically.
Okay.
Very good.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So you talked about the $220 million in school bonding debt.
Yes.
Currently. I think it was 90 million for Burlington, they found their own bonding.
Right, that's right. Yep.
And Winooski as well.
Yeah, then there was something like 58 million, I think.
Just curious, how would you, going forward, deal with, and my understanding is, going forward, if we do something with school construction, there's going to be a percentage by the state.
Yeah,
So these folks don't have a percentage by the state now.
right.
So how do you proceed going forward with folks that have bonding currently? Is it a fairness issue to try to somehow include some state money in paying off their bonds?
Yeah, we don't want to get too far into the policy realm. I think dealing with the political economy is the work of you all in this body. But I think that where we've observed the problems to be is that on who can pass and who cannot pass a bond. And so where we think that the state aid is essential is to allow communities to pass a bond and therefore address this huge backlog and this huge liability. So going forward is where we think it's most important, because we've observed communities that have deficient school facilities time and time again not pass that bond. So we really think it's most important prospectively.
And again, just to extrapolate on that a little bit, what you said, Representative Holcomb, as well, I think there's going to be a big discussion around whether it's South Burlington's already spent, you said, over $1 million in, fees for architects and all that sort of stuff. My understanding is, they're going to have to be looked at. I'm assuming that a school like that would probably take preference, correct? I mean, they've already spent an initial amount of money for that sort of thing. So, I think overall, there has to be an overall look across the state as to who's already invested a bunch of money in what they need. And then, of course, to go above and beyond that is, we don't even know once this governance structure takes place, what schools might be closed. I mean, you don't want to spend a bunch of money in schools that are going to be closed in a year.
Yeah, and that's it.
I think that's part of the school construction advisory I don't remember what it's called, I'm sorry, and I'm sure you do. That's part of their job is to decide where that money goes based on exactly those things. And it's one of the reasons that we did not include school construction in the excess spending exemptions, because we don't want people to spend money when everything's about to change. And I think it's why the sort of school construction fund is not set to take off until we know what these new districts are, but they.
And we're anxious for this clarity. Also, I mean, there are schools that or districts that pass a bond and we look at their enrollment numbers, you know, we look at everything and we're sort of being asked to make a policy choice. From a pure debt service repayment perspective, you know, we're comfortable with where their financials stand. Obviously, the interplay of the ed fund is a huge factor. So we're really just looking at liquidity and enrollment. But then we see enrollment numbers and we say, is this school going to be around in 20 years? And they're taking out 30-year debt. And so then we're like forced into a policy conversation we don't really want to be in. So we're anxious for this clarity. One, because of huge liability, and two, because of it's just putting us in an awkward spot.
Yeah. I really appreciate you because I've seen that situation. I'm also very conscious that there are places that have gone for the bond because they can, and other places that literally cannot. We have to have that conversation. So I wouldn't say it's their district. I think we have to talk about it being our districts, because even if we are separately governed locally, we have a single statewide ed fund and everybody is paying for those bonds. And if they can only pass in large districts, everybody is paying to build district, you know, bonds and infrastructure in those places, including places that could never pass a bond. And it's not in our foundation fund, but everybody needs buildings.
Let's get specific.
Okay, sounds great. So Ashwin sort of like covered it really well, so we'll just pack up and leave. But I just want to reiterate this aspect of preserving the state's rating so that the bond bank can leverage is the whole thing we're trying to do here. And Rhode Island did it successfully. And we think it's a great model. Rybeck sort of serves this role as agent for reimbursing the schools for the debt service that they paid. We already do that, so we just think it's a natural fit. And then also you can be assured that the bond bank is going to be monitoring the market for refundings and savings should that occur. Whereas if the school goes out on their own, issues debt, they may not be as, in particular if there's some subsidy, they might not have the same incentive structure to be monitoring the market. Particularly since it would be gargantuan for them to just figure out the capital markets and issue the debt anyway. So there's a number of reasons that we can talk about why we think it makes sense for us to serve that sort of fiscal agent role. And then it doesn't sort of endanger the state intercept that I talked about. So we can see we're not losing some aid that could otherwise be intercepted for our existing bonds. So that I'm happy with that. The question about the subject to appropriation and the sort of, again, the political economy of that. I mean, I think you all are going to be better at answering that than us. But, I don't know that is that different from the way the current system works. Like
It doesn't work.
Well, okay, from even what you're proposing, right? Every year you're going to be saying, okay, should we tweak the foundation formula? Should we, make changes at the margin they're always subject to some legislative risk. And I don't know that, I think they view it as a commitment, rightly or wrongly. And so I don't know. I'd be curious to hear what the school districts say. That part of this does not, again, I'm not a school district official, but we've worked with them. I'm not terribly worried about that, but I can see why when it's explicit like that, it's somewhat concerning. I think they generally feel like the state's made a commitment and like, regardless of what they say, we're going to hold you to that. I'm sure you hear that testimony. But that's the whole reason why fiscal agent, and then with regard to legacy debt. So we have a lot of experience with this. I mean, we've lived through school consolidation and a number of school consolidation and then deconsolidation. And we just follow the legal entity wherever it goes. The school consolidation was, the statute was clear about that liabilities, the uniform articles of, I always get the name wrong. The agreement, right? We're clear about assumption of liabilities. And so we just follow where the legal entity is by act of law. What concerns me in the way that the statute is written right now is like debt is not the only liability. There are many school districts that have VEMR's responsibilities. There are VEMR's, they aren't all on VESTers, you know, there's many have
Pension
VEMR's.
obligation.
Pension liabilities. So there are a number of different liabilities. So number one, just bare minimum, we'd like to just see it be liabilities, not debt. And two, you know, it sort of raises the question, like there's some question around the assumption of debt, which gives us like some anxiety, in likely in its current form would be something that we would need to disclose to bondholders, which I don't think is really the intent.
I have a question about that.
Yeah.
So debt is right now held around the state in ways that I don't want to quite use the word arbitrary, but I don't really have a better one. The way that some communities are able to pass bonds or historically have been able to pass higher taxes is correlated to seemingly nothing. Despite our best efforts to figure out what it's correlated with, including like journalists try to correlate it with political leanings and also did not succeed in finding correlation there. And so we have this debt carried around the state by districts. The state itself is planning on creating these new districts and creating a new financing and funding mechanism for those districts that is designed to create a level of equity around the state that we have never seen before. If those districts have an equitable funding mechanism all around the state, but are carrying very different levels of debt on their first birthday, they're not going to have equal opportunities to provide to their students. And so I think before this happens, we need to figure out something about that debt that's carried in very different ways around the state. And I understand the state assuming all of that debt is like a nightmarish proposition. I also understand that figuring out how to adjust the foundation formula to account for that debt on a district by district basis is going to set us up for profound inequities in the future. And so we're going to need to find, and not today in committee,
Right.
We are going to, over the next year, need to find a path through that. And I don't personally have an idea.
Yeah, I mean, I would just, some things to think about. So if some new entity, the good news is through the bond bank, this is like very easy, right? Like we just like change the unique identifier of the debt in terms of who it's associated with. If a new legacy or if a new district assumes it, we just bill somebody different, or there's a new central office or something like that. But if you're talking about, you know, the state assuming it like that, it's not like we just like hand these bonds over to the state. We'd have to like legally defease them. It's extremely expensive. It's very much not efficient. So I think it's fine to have this conversation. I just don't think we're uncomfortable with debt being called out specifically because it sort of raises the question that there's not going to be a home for this debt or for this repayment. And that's what we don't want to see. So I think even if it was as simple as just changing it to like legacy district liabilities, you know, you'll have a study committee on that. Great. I don't want to have debt be called out specifically because I think there should be no question that the debt's going to be repaid from some new form of district, right? And that's the intent. And that's what's making me a little anxious.
Okay. And I do agree that there are a lot of liabilities, including just like liabilities to the unemployment trust fund that might be carried differently around the state. And
Right.
those are all going to need to be figured out in the future.
Right.
So thank you for that.
Yeah.
And I hope for your partnership over the next year when we figure out what will happen with all.
Yeah, absolutely. And obviously we can tell you exactly what the debt service is associated with that district and help you work through the economics of that. So I think that's it. And then, you know, it is important for you to know, I think the last thing there, and there were some questions about this, is like, yeah, it's a bit of a magic trick that we say it's local school district debt, but we have a statewide education property tax. But we do still have general obligation. We still have a general obligation of that district, which was maintained in statute even after the changes to the statewide ed fund. So you know, if everything absolutely falls apart, we could still force that district to raise local taxes to repay us. And so that's a key part of this whole equation that's obviously never been used. But it is something that's outstanding there. And from the rating agency's perspective, they look at our statewide education fund essentially as a foundation formula. They haven't really spent the time to dissect it.
Right.
So that's kind of their viewpoint.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, Representative Wesson.
Could you just repeat that bit you said about just a minute ago about it being not efficient and expensive to transfer the debt theoretically to the state? You used a very technical term that I
Oh, yeah. So like there's this thing called defeasance. So that means the debt is no longer a liability of, say, the bond bank. I mean, I don't want to get too into this because I don't want this to happen, but I don't want to lay out the playbook for you. But the state would have to issue bonds. They would have to issue bonds sufficient to pay principal and interest until whenever we're allowed to redeem those bonds on our side. So that may either be to a redemption date, a call date, or maturity. Either way, you're going to have to fill that pot of money with more money than is actually due on the bonds so that you can make up the difference on our side. It's just an expensive proposition. That certainly is possible. It's just expensive, I guess, is the bottom line. It's inefficient. What is efficient is if the bond bank goes into our system and says, okay, it was X district and now it's Y district.
Right.
And we just change who we bill to. And then in terms of how they figure out where they get their money for, it's, maybe it's part of the foundation formula or it's by some other means and their dollars are fungible and they pay us.
Some other ways and means, perhaps?
Good.
Thank you.
Anything else for Michael? Yes.
4 questions.
Yes, okay, 4 questions. All right.
Okay.
Yeah, rapid.
And in a very general sense.
Yeah.
Who is the buyer of the bonds for the bond bank?
Oh, yeah.
Do you have a specific set of investment
question.
or is it into the market?
Yep. So it's both specific and non-specific. So bond bank, we exist in what's called a specialty state. So it's too small to have like a dedicated state fund like California would for purchasing municipal bonds. So individuals that want that benefit from the tax exemption buy our bonds directly. It's a relatively high tax state. I think we know that. So there's there's a lot of demand because of that. So long wind up here, about 40. What's that?
There's a lot of demand for our bonds since we're a high tax state.
Yes. Yep. Because they're state tax exempt. Same thing with the state's bond. The state benefits from that as well on the cost of capital. But about 40% of our buyers, depending on the interest rate environment, are individuals, either people buying it directly or through a financial advisor. And then the rest is national entities. Historically, it was bond funds, but they've become less significant in the market. And now it's a lot of national, what are called SMAs, separately managed accounts. That's really transformed the market over the last, say, 4 years. And then historically, insurance buyers were a big component. They've become less significant. We did see them in our last sale, but they, like us, were highly rated. They use it for asset and liability matching. But that's kind of the general scope these days.
Thank you. So just a few more. Rhode Island, with Ryback?
Yeah, it's Rhode Island, Rhode Island Health and Buildings Educational Commission, I think.
So with them, is it a statewide entity?
Yeah, it's an instrumentality like the bond bank.
So I'm just thinking about if there could be an assumption of all the existing liabilities for the existing districts, legacy districts, that is not necessarily the state, but an instrument of the state. Is that a?
Yeah, I think you run into that issue where, we've had some issues as a state with some of the mental health facilities that had issued bonds, and because they nearly 100% of their revenue sources are through state transfers, the rating agencies have considered them net tax supported debt, and this has been a little bit frustrating. So I think and we also tried to do the same thing with the housing bond back in 2017, where it ran through VHFA, and we tried to carve out some specific revenue. there just aren't a lot of opportunities to have things off balance sheet anymore. So to speak, like the GASB rule, the Government Accounting Standards Board, who is looking at liabilities, somebody had a question there. And same thing with the rating agencies. They basically anything is debt. So I think it's gonna be very, you're gonna have the same issue where you're gonna either have to say this is subject to budget and appropriation, but that's probably still gonna be on the state's books. I think it would be very difficult to accomplish that.
I'm just trying to figure out if it's.
Yeah,
not,
no, understood,
you
yeah.
know, larger districts consuming the liabilities or assuming the liabilities of the
Right.
smaller districts. Instead, if it's a statewide entity that can do that.
Right, I think you can accomplish the same thing through, okay, you've got one entity versus however many districts you come up with.
Yeah.
You know, you can accomplish the same thing and you are highly leading us towards the multiple district thing because the one entity would become part of the
Part of
state's
the
books,
state.
no matter
Right.
what we
Right.
call it.
That's right.
Okay.
So-
Similar to how an education-based income tax is still considered an income tax, even if you start the sentence with the word education.
Okay.
Okay. You have more questions?
Two others.
Great.
Right.
And then we're gonna wrap.
Okay. The other sources of funds, you mentioned USDA.
Yep,
And then some school districts have direct issued.
yep.
What else are we missing? Are there private equity funds that are out there saying, we're gonna build new schools?
Okay, this is something that I do think is interesting. So anybody, because of the tax exemption, like anything is probably going to be more expensive. But I do think we have a unique opportunity, and I said this to Senate Education, because we have so many schools that need to be built at the same time. Once we get our heads around like where they're going to be located and what is renovation versus new construction, you do have kind of an interesting opportunity, despite everything having to be rebuilt at the exact same time, in that we have scale. So we're always like the bond bank or the tax exempt entity is always going to be less expensive than the private equity option or something of the like. Just because of the tax exemption and the credit rating, but you could see kind of like a P3 private partnership opportunity that might, well, it may not make a difference in the cost of capital. It could de-risk the construction in terms of assuming construction risk and building all the schools at the same time, where, you know, you would go out and RFP 10 schools that all cost $100 million, and you're going to get better pricing and more entities interested than if you were design, bid, build in like each different district. So I think that's a real opportunity that should not be missed in this conversation. I think there was some language in 454, because I recommended to Senate Education to explore alternative delivery mechanisms, which is kind of what that's called. And in that case, you could see on particularly on the construction side of things, Rybeck starts paying the subsidy after construction is complete, but where they would form a partnership to sort of get all the working capital together and then would deliver the project to the district at X price on X date. So it's not exactly what you were asking, but it is a way to de-risk the delivery of the projects themselves. So I think we have a big opportunity here because we got a couple $1 billion worth of construction we're going to buy. And so we should use that to our advantage. And you could probably build an operation and maintenance into that contract as well.
I'll also add that when the school construction task force was doing work in 2023, we were also thinking that there could be potential funding sources through like the IIJA or like FEMA disaster recovery funds. Many of our school buildings are the town's like designated emergency shelter. Obviously, all of those are up in the air, but it doesn't mean that those opportunities might not, they could come back in a case.
Yeah, and that's a great point. We've been at the table with every entity that was or is hopefully benefiting from the IRA and in terms of getting low cost capital for efficiency purposes, but we don't have any deals. So we don't have any place to deploy that capital. We have $40 million commitment from USDA on energy efficiency lending that we're lending at 2%. And we don't have the school projects yet to warrant asking for more money from anybody, but we're there. So that's the great thing about the bond bank. We can like sort of survey the landscape and then optimize capital for whatever the project is.
Great, thank you. The last one we'll follow up with you. You had, I think, recommended a change in debt structure on bonds to go
Yes.
from your
Level debt service.
level debt service, which we did not incorporate because we didn't have time to take testimony on
Yes.
it. But
So essentially, governmental units can already do it if they pass what's called a note versus a bond. And so it's just adding transparency and simplicity to the statute. And what it has the impact of is driving down, because under what we have now is level principal. So what level principal means is that your first year of repayment is your highest repayment, and then it steps down after that. Whereas level debt service is what you have on your mortgage. It's just the same payment every single year. So that year one budget impact is going to be way less. And it's not like these entities are going to like give up the budget capacity when it steps down, right? They're going to like find a million other things to fill the void. So we just think it's like an incredibly transparent simplification of the code or of the statute, and will also has the impact of potentially lowering costs.
All your questions?
yeah, that's it.
That was great. Thank you.
That's fine.
Yep.
If a school district used a city for their bonding capacity, do they need a state law to be able to do the level debt service or not?
So your second question, they are, well, for your first question, they are units of government, so there's no real benefit to using a city. They're governmental entities, they can issue debt under their own name. Any governmental unit suffers right now from the way the statute's written in terms of not being able to do level debt service.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you
Great,
so much
thank
for your
you.
time today.
Pleasure.